In truth, it was in ancient Egypt, according to many scholars, that the tradition of marriage first appeared, and many traditions, sometimes just slightly altered, have carried over into our time as well. You're watching Flip Side of History, the other side of the known history, and today we will tell you about marriage traditions in ancient Egypt. The treatment of the wife in ancient Egypt is well known because of the teachings of Ptahhotep that have survived to our day. The sage of the ancient kingdom painted all the rules and so-called instructions in sufficient detail. Here it should be noted that the ancient Egyptians were characterized by the compilation of various teachings and manuals, how to act correctly in this or that situation. Thus, Ptahhotep wrote, "If you're a man of high status, you should have your own house and love your wife as is fitting. Fill her stomach and put clothes on her body. Cover her skin with oil. Let her heart rejoice all the time you're alive. She is a fertile field for her master. You must not argue with her in court. Do not drive her out of her mind. Share with her whatever falls to you. That will keep her in your house for a long time." The family formation procedure itself looked rather bizarre in some places. For example, it was considered that a boy was already quite mature enough to think about starting a family at the age of 10. Girls were given in marriage at the age of 12 to 13. At first, the groom's mother looked for a worthy bride, and then hired a special matchmaker. She began negotiations with the parents of the bride, preparing a meeting of the fathers. If an agreement was reached after the meeting, preparations for the marriage would begin. At the same time, if the young people refused to be husband and wife, no one particularly forced them, so it is impossible to talk about marriage exclusively as a parental treaty. If there were no obstacles, the classic marriage ceremony looked as follows. First, an engagement was made in the presence of a judge or priest, which meant that in the year, the newlyweds would be reunited. And during that year, the relatives dealt with the so-called procedural aspects. At one time in ancient Egypt, there was a tradition in which the own daughter was deprived of her virginity by her own father. He also taught her how to behave during intimacy with her husband, so that everyone would be satisfied. This tradition was mainly among the pharaohs, but it was also practiced by the lower classes. However, as time went on, things began to change, and the purity of the bride became a guarantee of marital happiness. The only restriction on the choice of couples was that they had to come from the same social class. Marriages between members of different class groups were simply not allowed. Therefore, quite often, marriages were concluded between related people, such as an uncle and a niece. The marriage between family members, father and daughter, brother and sister, had the right to conclude only pharaohs. Although as strange as it may seem, there was practically no wedding itself in ancient Egypt. The groom or the groom's relatives gave a bride price, and the young received gifts from both parties. And that was pretty much it. The young wife would enter her husband's house, or conversely, the husband would enter his wife's house. Before this event, the bride necessarily visited the temple of the goddess Isis, where she asked her to bless the marriage and save her from problems and troubles in the family. The only practically mandatory process was the conclusion of the marriage contract, which took place in the presence of the vicar of Pharaoh, the Jati, who was at the same time the judge. The marriage contract prescribed the property rights of the spouses, as well as the various options in case of unforeseen situations and circumstances. It was also obligatory and detailed to describe the kind of marital dowry that the wife contributed to the husband's house. Finally, the most interesting and unique thing was that the contract included separate ownership of property, even during the marriage. After the contract was signed, the young couple exchanged bracelets as a sign of fidelity, which were later replaced by rings that were put on the finger of the right hand. In reality, that was the end of the wedding. Of course, wealthy people could arrange magnificent celebrations on this occasion, and the pharaoh's holidays lasted for several days. But the main thing in ancient Egypt was simply the process of entering the bride's house and nothing more. We can only note that often the process of marriage was timed either to some religious celebrations or at the time of the Nile River, which was considered the life-giving god of all things. Despite the fact that the traditions of the ancient Egyptians suggested polygamous relationships, men generally lived with only one woman, and it wasn't a matter of remarkable fidelity, but of simple economic calculation. It was much easier to support one wife than 2 or 3 ones. The evidence that has survived to this present day shows that husbands generally treated their wives with the utmost reverence and cared about them. Despite this evidence, the Egyptian laws of the time allowed to beat unfaithful or in certain cases guilty wife. But there was a rather interesting limitation here. A woman could complain about her husband to the tribunal, and if the tribunal decided that the beatings were excessive, the man was sentenced to be punished with sticks. The maximum number of strokes was 100. In the case of repeated severe beatings, the judge ruled that the woman could not only have the right to all joint property, but also the status of sole mistress of the house. By the way, divorces in ancient Egypt were not encouraged, but they were in fact possible. The reasons for divorce could be childlessness of the wife, her improper behavior. This fact had to be proved in court, claims and insufficient fulfillment of obligations by the husband. So in other words, a woman in ancient Egypt was not a wordless slave, but a full-fledged member of society protected by the law. Speaking of the possibility of becoming the only mistress in the house, a lot of documents indicate that this was quite often one of the main reasons why men took care of their wives. After all, canny women always could provoke the spouse to raise their hands, and what would happen next was of course well understood by the husbands themselves. Therefore, it is not surprising at all that Ptahhotep wrote to men the main rule of behavior in the family. This is what he wrote. Do not burden your wife with nursing if you know she's in perfect health, and do not say to her, "Where is it? Bring it to us." When she has put the thing in a convenient place, be more silent and observe. In modern language, don't piss off or harass your spouse, or it will come back to fire. The Egyptian laws did not forbid having concubines or slaves with whom the head of the family could have intercourse, except with his legitimate wife. Only children born of such a relationship were restricted. They had no rights to property or status in the class. Therefore, it is shocking, but Egyptian wives reacted rather calmly to such excesses of their husbands. They did not face any consequences. And yet in the wedding tradition of ancient Egypt there was one, rather creepy peculiarity, which concerned the wedding with the river. Since the Nile was considered a god, and the harvest and the welfare of the Egyptians depended on the level of the river, every year there was a wedding ceremony with the sacred river. How this appeared? This tradition originated in the time of the pharaoh Zoser, under whom the Nile once failed to overflow, resulting in drought and famine. The priests assumed that this was a way for the god of the Nile to show his anger for disrespecting him. So Pharaoh ordered some of the most beautiful girls to be brought in, one of whom became the wife of the river. Since then, every year the most beautiful girl of Egypt was chosen for whom a spectacular wedding was played, and after the celebrations were over, the newlywed was thrown into the river. The tradition was discontinued after the false wedding during the reign of the Pharaoh of Egypt. When the choice fell on his own daughter, the ruler did not want to separate with his beloved child, and after the wedding the bride was replaced by throwing into the river an artistically made statue of the girl. Pharaoh's daughter herself was hiding in a secret place in the palace. After some time, Pharaoh faked an illness, and then the messenger of the Nile god appeared to the people, the resurrected daughter, after whose return from the river miraculously resurrected Egypt. Well, whether the Nile punished the Egyptians for such fraud is unknown to science. In any case, the family traditions of the ancient Egyptians, even in comparison with the present time, were rather more loyal and actually aimed at the preservation of normal and happy family ties. Thank you for watching this video. Subscribe to Flip Side of History and also leave a like.